A few years ago, I went on a vacation with some friends. The most memorable part was how one of our friends acted during the trip, because he was constantly contradicting himself. He would tell us he had so much fun, he wanted to come back for a week instead of a few days, but then a few minutes later, he was too broke to afford gas. He said he had $2 to his name, but then when we went out to eat, he refused to let anyone pay for his food and got stuff that cost a lot more than $2. Seeing all the drama play out around James Gunn, I can't help but remember that friend. James Gunn's excessive openness online has prompted a lot of people to call him out for contradicting himself time and time again. It's a tough situation for Gunn and his DCU because it seems as though public perception is becoming a bigger issue the more he talks. Considering that he hasn't even officially released a single project within his DCU, a lot of the criticism seems unwarranted, but is that really the case? The most popular example by far is the issue with Superman. Now, I'm a huge Henry Cavill fan, he's my favorite Superman by far. That being said, setting aside my bias, I don't think Gunn or any new leader should be forced to use a specific actor if their agreement was to start their own universe. Cavill was definitely cut before he could reach his prime as Superman, but Gunn was never obligated to use him. Where things began to get muddled was when we heard characters Gunn worked on, like Amanda Waller and Harley Quinn, were staying and will be portrayed by the same actors. Again, it's Gunn's universe. If he decides to let his personal biases influence his decisions, and the studio allows it, then there's not much that can be said about that. Fair is a term that gets thrown around a lot now, but the world is far from a fair place. Nobody really operates on the principle of fairness, especially in Hollywood.
It isn't fair! You goddamn assholes, it isn't fair!
The issue a lot of fans had is they wanted a true fresh start or to finish off what the DCEU had started. Gunn was pretty much riding that line hard, and frankly, that's to the DCU's detriment. If casual fans see Gal Gadot or Margot Robbie show up, they're not going to treat this as a new universe no matter how hard Gunn pushes that idea. Objectively speaking, Gunn is clearly a director who relies heavily on his own personal biases, rather than staying unbiased, objective, and trying to see what the fans want. Again, if the studio allows that, then it's hard to blame him for continuing to do so. It should be the studio's job to step in and help temper their creatives, but with the recent history of studios doing that too much, they might be hesitant to step in here. The issue with that is it leads creatives to indulge their egos and worst tendencies, since nobody is telling them no. Personally, I'm of the opinion that DC should just do a complete reboot, because to sit there and think about how arguably the actor fans love the most is the main one being recast is pretty ridiculous. All that died down a bit until recently when Gunn came out and said he was never making a young Superman movie. Fans were quick to point out the fact that age was his main excuse initially for dumping Cavill, and it led a lot of people to furiously go after Gunn online. Looking at the two actors, David is actually a few years older than Cavill was when he did Man of Steel, which was technically an origin story. Who knows when Superman Legacy will begin filming, so that could add another year or two onto David's age. That being said, if Gunn really has long-term plans, things start to make less sense. By the time he got around to a Justice League movie, David would presumably be about 36 to 37 years old. If Gunn really had a problem with Cavill's age, he's going to face practically the same age problem after the first Justice League movie with David. Why not cast someone younger? It leads me to think Gunn potentially plans to retire Superman after his first or second DCU chapter, and if the actress cast for Supergirl is significantly younger, then that would seem even more likely.
Not a great plan.
Then there's the most recent controversy he's found himself involved in. Some old posts resurfaced where he basically shits all over Keaton's first Batman movie, and then even takes a shot at what most fans consider the Holy Grail, the Nolan Batman films. Now, to be clear, I don't care what his opinions are on a personal level. It's his right to like or hate whatever he wants. It doesn't make him a bad person or anything like that. That being said, he isn't just any other DC fan. He's the person in charge of everything happening at DC for the foreseeable future. With that responsibility comes scrutiny. And when you talk about something you hate, that typically means you won't be including it in your version, which would understandably piss off fans of that product. It doesn't matter how old the comments are, because unless he denies they're real, which he isn't doing, they give fans an insight into what the man in charge of DC thinks about their favorite movies, as well as an inkling as to what he will and won't include in his own universe. There's two separate issues here, so let's start with the comments about Keaton's Batman. The first comment isn't that bad. Obviously, it is an older product, so it is a bit cheesier and campier than modern movies. Nothing wrong with pointing that out. The second comment is where the issues start, because he goes out of his way to insult everyone involved with the movie. Not only that, but he misses the point about Joker entirely. Joker is Jack Nicholson in The Shining with clown makeup, because that's the point of hiring Nicholson in that role. That's what they wanted him to bring to the character. Then he adds insult to injury with a third comment, discussing the soundtrack that is the worst work of everyone involved, despite it arguably being the most iconic Batman theme ever created, that was so beloved it was used in what people consider the greatest animated superhero series ever. His comment about Joker killing Wayne's parents is understandable, but then he points out the fact that Batman couldn't move his neck, which was really just a product of the times. A bit unfair to blame them for that, and then he caps it off by reaffirming his stance that it's a ridiculous, awful film.
Wow, that was kind of brutal.
Like I mentioned before, a normal fan having these opinions is fine. That's not the core issue here. He's not a normal fan anymore. He represents DC as a whole, so criticisms that come from him tell fans what to expect. And sitting there as the man in charge of DC, hating on DC classics, isn't a good look, especially at a time where most fans feel the people in charge of these studios hate the properties they're in charge of. Had he just mentioned he disliked those movies, it would be one thing. But what we're seeing here are some pretty strong beliefs and hard-hitting, borderline disrespectful insults. More so, it raises some interesting questions when you remember his comments about the Flash movie being one of the best superhero movies ever made. Most fans figured he was lying to help DC try to recover some money from what was set to become their $200 million failure, but assuming that's true, that means he's just a sellout who sold his opinion to his superiors. It also means, logically speaking, fans can't trust what he has to say anymore, because if he's willing to lie to help other people's products, who's to say he won't do worse to help his own? If we try to assume he genuinely believed The Flash was one of the best superhero movies ever made, that's where things get complicated. Doesn't really make sense to praise that movie and its story when he clearly feels so strongly about Keaton's Batman. He didn't just shit on the aspects of the movie that were due to older technology and movie making processes. He specifically called out the horrible acting. He literally says, and I quote, "Fuck you, everyone involved with that travesty," which includes Keaton. It's honestly hilarious to see him vehemently hating Keaton and his acting when you consider this is the same man who was supposedly responsible for including George Clooney in the Flash ending.
7 million. Never leave the cave without it.
Unless his mind functions without any need for logic and reason, which is believable at this point, there's no way he can have such a strong hatred for that movie and praise The Flash like he did. So that basically helps to confirm the theory that he lied about the Flash movie. Again, either way you slice it, the situation doesn't look good for Gunn and by proxy DC itself. The second issue is his stance on the Nolan films, and while he spoke less about those, considering how they're almost universally praised, it still caused an avalanche of anger. Most people would agree Batman Begins isn't a classic, but to say it isn't good is something a lot of people are taking issue with. He also calls out The Dark Knight as not being a classic, despite most fans considering it the greatest superhero movie ever. Not just the greatest Batman movie, but the greatest superhero movie ever. And he's saying it's not even a classic. Personally, I enjoyed Nolan's films. Not to the diehard extent of a lot of other people, but definitely more than Gunn apparently did. I have no issues with some valid criticisms about those movies because I have my own, but there's no doubt that that's the last thing fans wanted to hear him say after all we've heard already.
Please stop talking.
All of that brings me around to the main point of public perception. If you're still an avid Gunn supporter, by all means go ahead and ignore those things. But for the vast majority of people, it's getting harder to have faith in his plans. There's a reason that during the MCU's heyday, Kevin Feige was relatively silent save for a few interviews and Comic-Con appearances. You never know when saying something or expressing a belief will bite you in the ass in Hollywood because nobody ever knows where their careers are headed. That's a lesson Gunn desperately needs to learn if he wants his universe to succeed. A big issue with a director or writer shitting on someone else's work is the message it sends to people. They're in essence saying they can do better. So it leads people to compare that person's work with that of the people they're insulting. And considering Gunn crapped on Tim Burton and Christopher Nolan, that puts him in a very unfavorable light. That's not saying Gunn's resume isn't good, because I do enjoy his work, but he doesn't even come close to legends like those. So unfortunately for Gunn and DC, now a majority of the public dislikes him, doesn't trust him, or just simply has no faith in him as a leader capable of ushering in DC's rebirth. It's not about the individual issues themselves anymore. It's about the fact that a big portion of the audience perceives him that way, and it's going to be a massive uphill battle to win them back.
God help us all.
All of his mistakes have put an insane amount of pressure on Gunn and his fledgling DCU. It's safe to say no movie universe has had higher expectations before even airing his first official project. He's pretty much pissed off all types of fans at this point, whether it's Snyder's DCEU fans, Nolan's Dark Knight fans, and even fans of classic movies like Keaton's Batman. At the very least, there isn't a lot of goodwill left towards Gunn, and his recent actions haven't helped him at all. He's spent his short time in charge contradicting himself and riding the line between reboot and continuation, so much so he pissed off people enough to warrant another social media deep dive into the skeletons in his closet. After what he's been through due to old posts, you'd think he would have completely erased his online presence, but clearly this is a man who doesn't learn from his past mistakes, which, come to think of it, makes him the perfect fit for DC.